On a small sandy island off the coast of Peru, a band of Spanish explorers lay marooned and desperate. Their leader, Francisco Pizarro, had been searching for any sign of the vast new world that he thought existed in South America. His first two failed expeditions had left his men weary and mutinous, but Pizarro did not want his third expedition to end in failure. He took out his sword, drew a line in the sand, and said to his men, "There lies Peru with its riches. Here, Panama in its poverty. Choose each man or best becomes a brave Castilian. For my part, I go to the south." 13 Spaniards crossed that line, and it was on that evening in 1528 that Pizarro and those men would begin a journey that would see them explore new lands, topple great empires, and commit terrible atrocities in the name of their country and their God, and most importantly, shape the history of the Americas and the world as we know it.
Francisco Pizarro was born sometime in the 1470s to an illiterate Spanish swineherd in Trujillo, Spain. Pizarro would have witnessed the unification of Spain and the discovery of the Americas in 1492. In 1509, he sailed to the Americas, serving under Vasco Núñez de Balboa on his expedition in the Pacific. After helping Balboa's enemies overthrow and arrest him in 1519, he was given the position of mayor of Panama City. News from the north soon arrived that Hernán Cortés had overthrown the Aztec Emperor Montezuma and established the colony of New Spain. Pizarro had heard rumors that Montezuma's vast wealth was dwarfed by a great power to the south. He began expeditions off the western coast of South America in 1524 and yet again in 1526, but both of these expeditions were unsuccessful. By the unfortunate end of his second expedition, Pizarro was certain of the powerful, wealthy empire on the mainland. He sailed back to Spain to ask King Charles V for ships and men. He was granted his wish, and in 1529, Pizarro, his three brothers, and his close friend Diego de Almagro embarked on an exploration that would change the world forever.
Since the early 13th century, the Inca Empire had been expanding. Stretching down the South American coast, enveloping the Andes Mountains, Inca power had grown into the most powerful military force in the Americas. Its 3,000-mile-long empire was unrivaled, with 11,500 miles of road. The empire was home to over 16 million people, and it was all ruled by a single emperor with unlimited power, worshipped as a god. The current one was a man named Atahualpa, who had just ousted his brother Huáscar from power in a brutal civil war, a war that drastically weakened the empire. In addition to this, smallpox had just been introduced to the lands of South America a few years before.
They do not live in an environment that produces the kind of infectious diseases that exist in the old world. So when these diseases hit, as they inevitably will, they take a cataclysmic toll on the people of the Americas.
These things in combination meant that Pizarro landed at a uniquely vulnerable time for the Inca. Even so, their vast armies of tens of thousands of men wouldn't have a hard time smashing the foreign upstarts to pieces. At least, this is what Atahualpa believed. Pizarro's 168 men and 37 horses landed in Peru in 1532. They soon found emissaries of the great Inca and agreed to meet him at the city of Cajamarca on the other side of the Andes Mountains, the likes of which the Spanish had never encountered.
On November 15th, they entered Cajamarca. Fresh off the victories over his brother, Atahualpa's army of 80,000 was an intimidating sight for the small band of Spaniards. They met in the city square, Pizarro and his men, Atahualpa with 8,000 unarmed guards. A Catholic priest approached Atahualpa sitting on his litter. He claimed the book in his hands had the words of God in it. The Inca had no written language. Atahualpa had probably never even seen a book before. In a tragic misunderstanding of cultures, Atahualpa took the Bible and threw it on the ground. To the Spanish, this was an act of war against their god and their king. Cannons roared as the Spanish shot artillery from their walls. 100 Spanish cavalry charged into the square, sword in hand, cutting down every unarmed Inca in sight. The power of their cannons, the swiftness of their war horses, the bite of their steel, all had never been experienced in South America prior to this encounter.
It took medieval Europeans, centuries to figure out how foot soldiers could resist a cavalry charge. In a single battle, on flat ground, it cannot be defeated.
The Inca broke, and the Spanish charged for Atahualpa, cutting down his bears as new ones came up to replace them. Atahualpa was seized, and 2,000 Inca lay dead, another 5,000 captured, as the Spanish took no losses. In the history of the world, no battle has ever been as one-sided as this one, but even now, Pizarro and his men were trapped, deep in hostile territory with the Grand Inca as ransom. The stakes could not have been higher, but for the riches on the line, Pizarro and his men were willing to risk it all.
Using Atahualpa as a puppet ruler, Pizarro would demand the largest ransom in history. Atahualpa would hand over 25,000 pounds of silver and would fill his room to the ceiling with gold.
You've read the account of his ransom of Atahualpa and the room of gold and silver. I mean, nobody in Europe's ever seen that kind of treasure.
When they were done extracting money, Pizarro charged Atahualpa with the murder of his brother and sentenced him to death on July 25th, 1533. Andean culture dictates that the body cannot be burned in order to preserve the soul. Atahualpa was allowed to be hung, not burned, on the condition that he be converted to Christianity. He converted, and after his death, was burned anyways.
The Inca had made many enemies on their rise to power, and thousands of native allies joined Pizarro as well as many more Spanish reinforcements from Panama, adding to his now substantial power. The Spanish crowned a new Inca, Manco Yupanqui, but Manco, fed up with Spanish abuse, led 100,000 Inca warriors in a rebellion that would see them lay siege to Cusco and the new city of Lima. The short-lived rebellion, however, was crushed when Almagro returned to Peru after an expedition to Chile. The last great Inca leader fled in exile.
It was not long after the empire was firmly in Spanish control that the conquistadors started fighting over the plunder.
I don't think there's anything that Pizarro could have done, short of saying, you know what, Almagro, you're in charge.
The ensuing civil war between Pizarro and Diego de Almagro led to Almagro's execution and Pizarro's murder on June 26, 1541. It is said that Pizarro drew a cross in his own blood and shouted Jesus as he lay dying on the floor. How similar it was how the two friends killed each other over the same wealth that Atahualpa killed his brother. His murderers, after fleeing to Manco's army, murdered him as well to gain Spanish favor. Inca resistance essentially died with Manco Yupanqui. Just like that, the three great leaders dead, all in the same year.
Even with Pizarro dead, the Spanish were now in complete control of the empire. They had made a fortune looting the Inca treasure and temples, but that was nothing compared to what was to come. A mountain, practically made of silver, Potosi in modern Bolivia. At 3,000 feet, the town they built there was where mass amounts of Inca slaves were to mine for silver. Almost all would die in the brutal conditions. The tragic events that unfolded in the Andes is unforgettable, as thousands of native people were turned into slaves. In the wider world, however, events unfolded in a much different way. The 89,400,000 pounds of silver that would come out of Potosi would dramatically impact the globe. The European supply of silver would be tripled, the massive influx of wealth helping Europe's economy boom. About 1/3 of all the silver went to China, and for the first time, a truly global economy was formed, as the Spanish pieces of 8 were becoming a universal currency. The Spanish traded American silver for Chinese silk, which was in turn traded in Africa for slaves that were used to mine the American metal. Spanish prosperity did not last, however. The mass amounts of silver created drastic inflation in Spain. Inflation was not yet understood, and the nation failed to increase taxes. All the wealth going to Spain did nothing except attract rivals. The Spanish would declare bankruptcy several times in the next century, as expensive wars and crippling inflation dealt devastating blows. Even so, the economy they created remained, and it was the British and the French that would eventually replace the Spanish role in the emerging modern world.
The exchange between the Inca and the Spaniards also caused key plants and animal species to make their way across the Atlantic with precious metals, most notably the potato.
The central effect that this encounter had was agriculture. Potatoes grow in land that doesn't support wheat or corn. So potatoes are this enormous new source of calories, and it allows for European population to expand by about 20%.
The effect of the potato was mostly felt in Northern Europe. Germany, Britain, Russia all experienced massive population growth, changing the balance of power in Europe. In the Americas, the natives would be exposed to a much larger array of new plants and animals and the diseases that came with them. Pizarro's explorations changed the world in ways that are often misunderstood. What ultimately shapes human history are not great wars or conquests, but the connections and exchanges between people. Wealth, not just in the monetary sense, but in the forms of food, technology, and culture, was spread around the world. The discovery of new lands and the creation of a truly international economy worked together to create a smaller Earth. When Pizarro's atrocities allowed Andean wealth to be released around the globe, a new age of prosperity came to the West, and this was just the beginning. Europe would use this new wealth to dominate the world. For these reasons, the fateful day at Cajamarca was not just an encounter between the Inca and the Spanish, but an encounter between Europe and the rest of the world, a connection of the entire world. The history of the modern era began with this. For better or for worse, the day that Atahualpa threw that book on the ground and worlds collided would shape our history for centuries to come.